Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for July 27th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. At Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, joining me again this week is my good buddy from Basic Brewing Video, Steve Wilkes.
Thanks, James. It's a pleasure to be back on Basic Brewing Radio.
It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
And we are continuing our discussion about the National Homebrewers Conference down in Orlando.
What a great time that was.
Which happened so long ago by now, by the time people are listening to
What conference? What are they talking about?
Yeah, the conference is ancient history, but the knowledge lives on thanks to our recording of all the wonderful folks that we were able to snag.
You know this will be in the Smithsonian someday.
Will it?
Oh, yeah. This kind of information? Are you kidding me?
Will our microphone... If we were to donate... they got Archie Bunker's chair. They got Fonzie's leather jacket. Mm-hmm. What of our stuff would be in the Smithsonian?
I think probably your immersion chiller and
my wort chiller.
Your wort chiller and the microphone in front of me. Not in that order.
Well, I hope it's a long time because I'm using that thing.
You just have to check it out.
Yeah, I have to go to Washington, D.C. to brew.
Yeah.
That would not be handy.
Enough of this patter.
Enough of the patter. We're drinking a porter. With our patter. This is porter patter.
Porter patter.
This is probably why we're having so much patter.
Porter pitter patter.
And luckily, it's a session beer. It's around 4% alcohol, something like that. Maybe a little less even. I'm not sure. It's just a low gravity,
very clean
session beer. Well, thank you very much. Mm-hmm. And it's just a fun beer to. It's a good summertime beer because it's not heavy.
Yeah.
It's kind of light and refreshing, but you still get the roastiness of the porter. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Last week we talked to homebrewers. Mm-hmm. This week we move into professionals, both professional brewers and people who are professionals in and around the brewing industry. Okay. So we've got 4 interviews on tap. And maybe we should just launch into the first one.
I think so. I think that John Pinkerton from Moon River Brew Pub.
This was a session that you attended.
That I attended. And John spoke about wort boiling and just what happens in that process. And he is a very interesting man, so let's let him do the talking. It's John Pinkerton, is that right?
John Pinkerton. Yeah.
John Pinkerton, the Moon River Brewing Company.
Indeed. Savannah, Georgia. We're a brew pub in Savannah, Georgia.
And about how many, 15 barrels, how much beer is that?
15 barrels is essentially 30 kegs, if you want to think of it like that, 30 half-barrel kegs. We produce about 1,200 barrels a year at this point. We're kind of at our capacity at this point.
What's the main style of beer that you do, or what's your most popular beer?
In-house, for sure, our most popular beer is our IPA. Second to that would probably be our wit beer that we produce year-round. We have such a demand for it. Off-premise, however, we do a beer called Savannah Fest. That's what we tasted here today.
It was excellent, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is kind of ironic to use it as a control, considering how much, it's a German-style beer. We use German malt, which already has a little bit of an elevated DMS character, and so we put DMS on top of that, and boy, you could really get the flavor.
Now, your talk today seemed to me to be a lot about how to minimize DMS in the beer. If I heard that right, did I?
Yes, correct. There's a place for DMS, and it's going to be in all beers, no matter what you do. But elevated quantities can get to be unpleasant to taste.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to talk a little bit about our friends out there that are still and love to make extract beers, just for a moment. And is there any reason, if you're dealing with an extract, a malt extract, so it's already been a wort and it's kind of dehydrated now, is there any reason to boil that beer other than it's what we've heard all our lives for an hour or an hour and a half? If you've brought it back up to temperature and you've stabilized it in terms of safety, is there anything to be gained if you're late hopping the beer?
Well, I knew this question would come up because it's been one that I've wondered about myself, and I've never really gotten a solid answer. But what logic tells me is that there's no real limit to how much DMS will be produce. I mean, I guess there is a limit to the how much precursor there is, but I don't think I don't think that limit has been hit just by virtue of dehydrating this wort as extract. And so my intuition tells me that it should probably be boiled. And it should be handled probably about the same you would any other beer. In other words, what I was saying is basically boil. Don't overboil, but minimize your time on the hot side. Because I think if my intuition serves correctly, what I think is there's probably still precursor that will turn into DMS if left on the hot side without good volatilization. And I think you would just need to treat it just like you would any other wort. I don't know that you necessarily need to boil it for long, but the whole idea is that you're bringing it up to temperature so you can add hops. So that's going to take some time. So I mean, in my mind, you just need to take the same amount of time you would normally with a regular beer in terms of the boil itself. So
yeah, when I started brewing, like most people, I read Charlie Papazian's book, and everything was boiled 45 minutes. It seemed like all the recipes. So pretty much that's the same advice that you'd give now.
I think so. It's funny because it's been a long time since I went back to the Papazian books, and I'd forgotten that he only recommended 45 minutes. But I think that was probably sound then, and it's probably sound today. Like I said in the talk, I think boiling for any more than an hour is a waste of time and energy. And I think that with good volatilization, if you've got a good boil, I think you probably bring it down to close to 30 minutes. And that's what some of these new technologies are trying to do, is trying to figure out a way to get better volatilization with actually less boiling.
Well, I know that me and the buddy of mine that I brew with at basicbrewing.com, one of the things that we're always looking for is, well, how do we shorten our brew day? We're just a couple of guys at home brewing, and we're trying to be more efficient. But the efficiency that we're after is not to take 6 hours of our day to make a batch of beer, because we got to get dinner for the kids.
I hear you, yeah. Oh, man, a typical brewing day for me is 10 hours because, by the time you set it up and get the wort made and clean up, it's a good solid 10 hours for me. But, yeah, time is money, and beyond just that, I have a family too. Being in the brew pub business, which is to say being in the restaurant business, I don't spend nearly enough time at home. So, what I ended up doing with my process is that when I started doing this research, I ended up actually adding more time to my day, which is really unfortunate. But, it's about the quality of the beer. I felt like I was making a significant quality improvement. Specifically what I'm talking about is, I was talking to somebody just a minute ago that instead of striking your kettle as soon as you start lautering, like most guys, once they got a couple inches of wort in the bottom of the kettle, they fire it. And they fire it so that the idea being so that by the time you get to a full kettle, you're pretty much boiling. Well, I don't want to necessarily go on record as saying that's wrong. I'm just going to say, here's the possibility that if you strike as soon as the bottom of your kettle is covered, some of that wort is getting heated for a lot longer than others. It's certainly being heated for a lot longer than your last runnings. And I just think in terms of thermal stress, why not just wait until you got a full volume in the kettle and then treat all the wort the same?
That's actually what I do for no reason, and that's just the way I do it. I never even thought about it.
Well, for years, what I did is I fired the kettle as soon as the bottom of the kettle was fired, and our lauter usually takes an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, depending on how distracted I am. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is that my kettle takes 2 hours to come to a boil, which is ridiculously long, and we'll solve that problem eventually. But what I used to do in the day before I knew better is I used to boil for 2 hours, because I thought the idea was boil it, and this kind of goes back to what you're talking about with the extract. I thought, well, if you just boiled it for even longer, you're going to get rid. At some point there's got to be an endpoint to that precursor. I think you could boil for 2 days and you'd still be making DMS. I'm speaking a little bit from ignorance at this point, but that's kind of my gut feeling.
Well, John, it's been nice to talk with you. I appreciate your time, and I hope I make it to your brew pub someday.
I hope you do too. I think you'll be pleased. Our big emphasis is variety. Basically the same emphasis that's applied throughout the craft brewing industry. The big motto nowadays is diversity. Yeah. This is what this country's all about, and this is what craft brewing is all about.
I'm telling you, I love it.
Right on.
Wow, I didn't know how complicated boiling really is. There's so much to know about. And what a fascinating discussion.
There's a lot going on in there, and there's a lot more, in all of these interviews. Just about there are a couple that we really went into detail on that you'll hear probably next week and the week after. We've got more longer format interviews, but really, to get all of what goes on in those hour-long sessions, you really have to be at the hour-long session.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, what we're trying to do is give you nuggets of information, nuggets of wisdom that we've gleaned out of those sessions. And, as I like to say, our goal at Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video is to help you become better brewers. And if you come out with some information on the other side of after listening or watching the podcast, then we've done our job. And selfishly, I'm looking for information to make me a better viewer, a better brewer. So, now I attended a session with our good friend David Logston, who I've been calling Dave Logston for months.
A little too familiar.
Yeah, well, it turns out he likes to be called David, but he's such a nice guy.
But you like to be called James.
I like to be called, and the thing is, he asked me, he said, do you go by James or Jim? I said, James. And I said, well, you go by Dave, right? And he said, well, people call me Dave. And I said, well, okay, well, I'm sorry, I've been calling you Dave. He said, that's all right. I said, no, it's not. But his email address is like dave@yeast. So that even his anyway. Yeah. So anyway, David Logston from Yeast, who's one of the nicest guys that you'll meet, and it's so nice to meet him in person. And he's such a knowledgeable guy. Mm-hmm. His session, they did some experiments, so it's right up our alley. They did some experiments with yeast strains and beer styles, and it's these certain yeast strain has been bred over time to go with certain styles of beer, certain recipes of beer. And what they did was kind of a flip-flop to see what would happen. Now, you just gave a presentation on yeast strains and styles. And you did what we're liking to do nowadays on the podcast. You did some experiments. And talk about, you kind of played with the ESB style and with the Czech Pilsner style and kind of flip-flopped the yeasts. Talk about that, first of all.
Well, we used both strains in each beer formulation that we did, the ESB style and the Pilsner style. Now, we wanted to show the brewers that were attending how much importance that the right yeast strain has on getting the beer to taste what it should be like. You can make pretty good beer even with a substantial formulation, but when you start compounding the variables with yeast strains that are really not appropriate to bring out those stylistic characters that you want, then you've got beer that's it's okay, but it doesn't say anything special. It doesn't catch your taste buds and say, wow, I like the taste of this beer. And that's what I think is the difference between making a beer, making a good beer, or making a great beer.
And it was interesting the characteristics of the yeast and the malt and hop formulation, they really kind of clashed.
They did clash, and as we noticed with the ESB, we could see that the flavors for that style came out beautifully. The hops were very tasty in both the aroma and flavor. Then, in contrast, when you have the wrong yeast strain in there, the hop profile just didn't come out. And what did come out was harsh and a little undesirable because the other components of the fermentation just didn't bring all that together.
Yeah, so the ESB with the ESB yeast was wonderful, but the ESB with the Czech Pilsner yeast was nasty. Not nasty,
but just not just nothing to write home about.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So these and vice versa. The Czech Pilsner style with the ESB yeast was not desirable as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's what brewers learn sometimes by mistake. Sometimes they just don't fully understand what the importance is or Like I mentioned in the talk, sometimes professional brewers will use a house yeast to make a different beer style. And yeah, they can make it and they can make a drinkable beer, but it's not an outstanding beer. Yeah.
And what does that say about the way styles have evolved? I mean, because a lot of people are trying to push the limits of styles or brewing outside of styles, and some are having success, obviously. But what does that say about the evolution of styles in that you could take a recipe and just switch the yeasts and either have a wonderful beer or a not so good beer?
Well, when you talk about beer styles, they pretty much developed over time out of default. English made English ales in warm fermentation, and they had a certain malt that they were using, and the hops that grew regionally there all came together, and the yeast that were eventually isolated from these different brewery regions had a profile that was consistent with the ingredients used, and they undoubtedly mutated to some extent over centuries, really, to be what they are now. And so now, since then, you speed ahead to today, and we can take these yeast strains from all over the world. We can buy malts and hops from all over the world, and we can even emulate water styles. And so we have so much information on brewing history and technique and methodology that have been used and developed over the last century in particular. Now in the hands of any individual with creativity. So you really have the opportunity to mix things and change things around. And now we're seeing some new beer styles come out. I think probably because of this, and some of them are pleasant surprises.
So I guess if what I'm getting from you is, feel free to experiment, but know that the styles, the established styles, are there for a reason, and kind of keep that in the back of your head while you're experimenting?
Well, the one thing is that when people look for a British bitter, they know what they expect, and that's usually what they get. If they're going for a Bohemian Pilsner or a German-style Pilsner, the style has developed over time, and people are accustomed and familiar with that. And those are great beers because they've lasted through time, and they maintain their interest and popularity not only with the local region where they're brewed at, but now with being able to not only ship the ingredients, the finished beer goes around the world as well. And I think probably one of the things that happens with moving beer around the world is that you don't get the freshness that you get regionally where the beer is brewed, and beer is very fragile, and I think a lot of people just don't really understand that. I taste so many oxidized beers that have traveled around the world that are barely a shadow of what they were when they were brewed, and a lot of people I don't think know what the beer should taste like, and even though it can be pretty good, it's changed a lot. And I had something to add about my recent trip to Belgium last month. There's a lot of, I love Belgian beers and a lot of the different styles, and what I find in the U.S., there's always something new popping up or something I haven't seen before, and I drink that, and over the years I've kind of became a little bit jaded or a little bit opinionated about some beers I like better than others. But when I go to the country where they're brewed at and taste them fresh there, it's a whole new light, and it's a whole new flavor and appreciation for the beer that it is there where it's fresh at. So if I could take anything from this, if you really want to appreciate the best beer possible, drink fresh beer. Even big beers that are intended to age and take time to develop still are better in their prime. And one of the best things you can do, buy cold beer, keep your beer cold. If you're a brewer, keep your beer as cold as possible, dark, in a place that's it's going to maintain that character that you put into it.
So take care of your beer.
Take care of your beer. It'll take care of you.
Well, I just briefly want to get into the second kind of part of the presentation where you took a standard style and then threw some wild things in there on top of it. You got some really interesting things.
Well, we'd like to do multiple strain fermentations because we can broaden the complexity of beer, and we're maybe even tinkering with the style somewhat when we do that.
And then you up yeast sales as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing for everybody, whether they realize it or not. But we're kind of moving them in that direction. For better or worse, I think the beer can gain a lot of character, and I think that's what we saw in the tasting today. That just adds a whole new dimension to the beer, and it's a fun thing. And a lot of people aren't familiar with some of these strains, and that's why I wanted to just bring them out and show them what could be done, and some of the fun we have with our test brewing.
I'm teasing you, obviously. The different strains did add different character. Talk about the strains that you put in, the multiple pairings and all that, and what some of the characters that you got out of those.
Well, we used lactic acid bacteria in the Berliner Weiss, but that's quite traditional. So you'd find that in any Berliner Weiss or any beer that style. The addition of the Brettanomyces yeast is what we found to be a fun and interesting variable, because we use two different Brettanomyces strains, the Bruxellensis and the Lambicus, and each of those, even though they have some similarities, they got their own unique properties also. And with those unique properties, brought out a whole different dimension of the beer. It changed the profile, it changed the esters. It adds such a dimension to it that each one finds a different finish on the beer, and some work better than others. Some may not work. I think in what we did, thought they both worked well, but in each one of the three different beers we used that variable in, it added a nice pleasant profile. One was more desirable than the other, and I think that's a lot of good with personal taste, and with the beer type that you're brewing. Your brewing technique is all going to come in to have an impact on what that finished beer is, because you can give any brewer the same ingredients and conditions, and you'll come up with a different beer. It's very difficult to duplicate identically what somebody else can do, especially on a one-up. Yeah, you can work on it over time and get things dialed in pretty well sometimes if you're a good brewer. But every beer is unique in that respect, that when it comes from your brew house and you're the brewer, it's your beer.
And that's what makes homebrewing interesting. Well, I enjoyed the experiment. I enjoyed talking to you.
Well, it's great to catch up with you. I hope we get to talk again in the future sometime. I'm always around, and we'll come up with some other good opportunity to make some beer and taste some different and interesting things.
When I first started brewing, I was kind of skeptical on the styles. Who's going to tell me what kind of style? I'll make whatever beer I want.
I'll make what I want.
But the more I learn about it, talking to Mark and Tess Samatulski of the Clone Brew folks, and they're talking to stick with styles or start with styles. Mm-hmm. And then, designing great beers. Ray Daniels, he talks about the styles of beers. And this experiment really kind of opened my eyes in that if you put a yeast strain that's the wrong strain for the style or the recipe that it goes with, mm-hmm. it's not as good. It's just generations of brewers that have come up with these recipes to go with their yeast styles or yeast strains, or vice versa.
Right.
So I think that we can learn from the past.
So if you're making a bitter, you should use an English ale yeast.
Yeah. If you're making a Pilsner, you should use a lager yeast that, mm-hmm. that goes with that style of beer. Mm-hmm. So, you can do some experimenting, but keep in mind that there's a reason why those styles are there.
Yeah.
And if you come out with unpredictable results, maybe you should learn something from that.
Well, there you go.
There you go. So we went to the keynote address, which was given by Greg Cook of Stone Brewing Company. And, of course, he was surrounded by people after the keynote address. And he's an interesting guy. And, he's known for, Stone Brewing Company is known for the bold styles of beer. And we had, at every table, there was a pitcher of Stone IPA and a pitcher of Arrogant Bastard.
Yeah.
And you, of course, reached for the iced tea pitcher, not knowing what you were doing.
I thought it was an English mild with ice in it. What did I know? I didn't get it.
So you poured yourself some iced tea, and someone said, "Okay, can you hand me the Arrogant Bastard?" And you said, "What?" So Steve wound up drinking Arrogant Bastard from his coffee cup.
Yes, I did.
But it was just as good.
It was excellent.
And so Greg Cook is as bold as the beers that he makes. And we were able to snag him just briefly after his keynote to talk about his philosophy of not dumbing down your beer for your guests. What is your advice to a good home brewer who keeps a six-pack of light beer in his fridge for his friends who don't like to drink his beer?
I personally do not allow any substandard beers in my house. I don't see any reason to. It doesn't matter whether you're a beer enthusiast or a home brewer or a professional brewer. So I would suggest doing exactly as I do in this particular case. Most of the time I don't recommend that, but in this case I recommend doing exactly as I do. Don't let any substandard beer in your house. It's like making somebody a great dinner, but hey, my friend Joe doesn't like great beer or great dinner, so I'm going to serve him a bologna sandwich and a light beer. I wouldn't do it. If that's what you want, you're not going to find it in my house. So don't lower the standards to the guest. Help the guest raise their standards. They might take a little cajoling. Hell, it might take force. But help the guest raise their standards. They're a friend of yours. You owe it to them.
So you would say go straight to the Stones and not go to a stepping stone kind of what is seen as a less extreme beer?
Go straight to something that you personally believe is outstanding. Everybody has different tastes. I mean, that's part of the beauty of the world. But if you have some of your favorite beers and you use those to bring somebody into the fold of great beer, that is the best method.
Now, how did you get to your brewing style? I mean, you're seen as one of the extreme brewers out, and extreme is overused, but you're one that takes probably the biggest chances, wouldn't you say? How did you get to that philosophy?
Well, it's really plays off of what I just said about not letting substandard beer come into the house or not serving it to your friends. My partner Steve Wagner, our brewmaster, and I decided what we thought was great beer. And then we refused to budge off of that. And our philosophy was, if somebody wants what we think is great beer, if they enjoy that, then we're the ones for them. And if somebody doesn't want it, then we are not the ones for them. And I don't want to confuse the public, because the public's already confused anyways. And I don't want to confuse ourselves by trying to split the difference somewhere along the line. Besides the fact, I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to brew only what I thought was great beer.
So if you're urging home brewers to step out there, try new things, and risk failure, but getting something new and interesting that they might enjoy.
Yeah, I suggest that they follow their passion, their heart, their whatever it is that's leading them into home brewing, whatever it is. If they want to make a light beer, by God, they should make a light beer. Why they'd want to, I don't know, but really, they should follow their own individual passion. So what I really advocate against is watering down their personal passion and by imagining how somebody else is or is not going to react to it. Do not imagine how somebody else is going to react to it. Only do what you feel.
Brew for yourself.
Exactly.
And the others, they're not worthy.
Precisely. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
So Greg Cook says, if you've got friends who like the nasty beers, don't buy nasty beers. So, when they come over to your house, if they want to drink nasty beer, they've got to bring it themselves.
Life is too short to drink bad beer.
Yeah, exactly. And, I've been doing that lately. we've got some good friends who, bless her heart, she likes, this woman likes Coors Light. And there's nothing, not saying anything bad against Coors Light. It's not a bad tasting beer. It's just a non-tasting beer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I just stopped. I have in the past bought those kinds of beers to placate the people who come over the house. But I've noticed that since I've stopped doing that and just put homebrew and good beers, good commercial beers in the cooler, more people have been trying the good beers. Mm-hmm. And, I've been kind of turning them around.
Well, you're a prophet. You've come down off the mountain.
Let me get off my high horse. But no, the other day I introduced a friend of mine, or friends of ours, who he usually drinks, the American light beers. And I said, here's a Hefeweizen that I made. It's a German wheat beer style. Mm-hmm. And it tastes a little bit like bananas. And that kind of got his attention. He smelled it and, hey, yeah, this kind of – and before the evening was out, he had like 3 of them. So, that's an indication that he liked the beers.
Yeah.
And luckily, I think his wife was driving, number one. And, they were they were low gravity, fairly low gravity Hefeweizen. So, it wasn't a problem that he had 3. But speaking of Hefeweizen,
which are high in ester production.
And, I've said before, maybe in this show, that, part of the reason for, my doing this show is selfish reasons, and talking to the experts and, asking the questions that I want to ask on, how to improve my beers personally. And, everybody that listens will profit as well from that. I was able to catch Lynn Kruger, who's president of the Siebel Institute. She had given a presentation on flavors generated in fermentation, what happens in fermentation. And so I didn't want to ask a broad question. What I did was I narrowed it down to ester production. First of all, let's start off with the basics. What are esters and what do they contribute to the beer?
Okay, esters are a particular chemical compound that's produced by yeast during fermentation, and they produce a variety of different flavors, but the predominant one that most people pick up due to esters is a banana, pear drop, fruity kind of flavor. So that's probably the most common one you'd associate with esters.
And some beers, the fruity esters are appropriate, and some are not, correct?
That's correct. It depends very much on the beer style. So generally, if you're looking at most lager beers and you're looking at Pilsner type beers, you don't want any ester. That's not part of the characteristic. But most ales, some fruity ester is desirable, and obviously in some ales, fairly predominant fruity ester is desirable. Something like a Hefeweizen, where you have a very fruity banana, but you also have the clove phenol, so nice balance there.
And what are the factors the control factors that you're looking at, especially in the homebrew environment, when you're looking at controlling the ester production?
Okay, probably the first thing you need to decide is what yeast strain you're going to use, because the yeast strain is going to have a big influence on the levels of esters that are produced. Some produce a lot, some produce a little. So choose your strain depending on your style. Once you have your strain, probably the next biggest influence is going to be temperature. So decide what temperature you're going to ferment at. The higher the temperature, the more ester you're going to get. Then the next would be dissolved oxygen. So how much air or oxygen you're going to give your yeast at the beginning of fermentation so that it can grow. And there, the more oxygen you give it, the less ester you're going to produce. The third thing you can control as a home brewer is pitching rate, the quantity of yeast that you're going to add to the fermentation. And the lower the quantity of yeast, so the lower the pitching rate, the more of the fruity banana ester you will produce. Yeah.
So it's a balancing act, isn't it? Because if you overdo, if you underpitch, if you overdo the temperature, your beer is going to suffer, and if you underpitch, you have a risk of the beer not being attenuated. So how do you strike that balance? I know it's a broad question, but how do you strike that balance when you're thinking about controlling the ester production?
I think, it isn't interesting because it's all a compromise and it's all a balancing act. I think what number of things you have to bear in mind, no matter what kind of flavors you're going to produce. Don't pitch too low, and I would say the lowest you ever want to pitch anything is about 3 million cells per milliliter. So you really don't want to go lower than that. You may start running into problems. If you're looking at temperature, you can go on the low side to produce less, but if you want to go on the high side, again, more than 23, 24 degrees centigrade, you're pushing the envelope. And as far as dissolved oxygen, you really need to know what the minimum amount is your yeast needs in order to grow and divide. And that's where the yeast strain and how much it needs is important. So you need to know those things so that you don't go below what the yeast is going to tolerate.
So a little research per style is probably warranted.
Yeah, and to know your yeast strain. And, if I used to work for a major brewing company, and we actually made a lager beer that we tried to get a lot of ester into it. So it's an unusual lager beer. And the way we did that was very stressful to the yeast. So it was the one beer we never harvested yeast from to reuse because we knew we're pushing the limits here. For a lager yeast to make a lot of ester, we limited the amount of oxygen, high temperature, we used a lot of glucose as an adjunct, all sorts of things. We lowered the pitching rate, but all sorts of things that are going to give you ester, but all of which are very stressful for the yeast. And we would quite routinely have problems in that fermentation if the yeast was not in absolute tip-top shape when it was pitched in. So you've got to be careful. Yeah.
Talking about temperature, is there a strategy of either raising the temperature or lowering the temperature during fermentation, or is there a timing to that, or is it just maintaining a steady temperature rate or temperature during fermentation?
Depends again on what you're trying to achieve. If we're looking specifically at esters, well, it depends what you want to do. Now, some people will collect, or they'll start off their fermentation a lot colder and then let it gradually increase. Some people will start the fermentation at the temperature they're going to ferment at. That's going to give you slightly different levels of ester, slightly different levels of flavor compounds. Increasing the temperature is going to give you more of the flavor compounds. You generally, sometimes with ales, you may step down towards the end, which is going to limit the amount of ester. Because a lot of these esters are produced later in the fermentation because you've got to have the fusel alcohols produced first and the acids, and then they react. So, some of the temperature steps you do towards the later parts of fermentation can influence this as well. So you play around with it depending on exactly what you want.
Are there other compounds that are undesirable that you could accidentally produce at the same time that you're using the strategy to produce the esters?
Oh, yes. The yeast is not, doing this in isolation. And obviously, anything you do is going to influence a lot of other flavor compounds. So you have fusel alcohols that are going to be affected by what you do. You could, diacetyl, various other flavor compounds. And it depends on exactly what you're doing to encourage ester production. But one has to bear in mind that whatever you do is affecting the yeast in its entirety during fermentation. So it's going to produce differences in all the flavor compounds. Some will go up, some will come down, and it's a balancing act depending on what you want to achieve.
There are a lot of variables, and you wouldn't think just on the surface of it that it would be such a complicated process, but there's so much going on inside that fermenting wort.
It is. I think, you think about it, yeasts are living little, I think of them as little one-celled people. That's really what they are, and it's the best way to understand yeast. They're little one-celled people, so, there are things they like, things they don't like. They work well under certain conditions. They don't work well under other conditions. And whatever you do affects the whole cell and everything it does. It doesn't just affect one little portion. So, yeah, it's kind of complex. That's what makes it fun.
Let me go through, or let's talk about one specific style. You mentioned banana, and the Hefeweizen is the one probably most known for the banana esters.
Yes.
What is the best strategy to get the best banana out of a Hefeweizen?
Okay. Firstly, you're pitching fairly low in a Hefeweizen. So pitching rate there, you're looking probably about 3-4 million cells per milliliter that you're starting off at. You would, because it's a low pitching rate, you give the yeast maybe, a limited amount of oxygen, not too little, but you'd be maybe around, 6 parts per million, or just air saturation, easier, air saturation. And I would not ferment at a very high temperature for a Hefeweizen. I think those two alone, and you're going to be at ale temperatures anyhow, but I would tend to do a Hefeweizen at closer to maybe 20 degrees, maybe even 19, so about 68 Fahrenheit. I really wouldn't go much above that. Then I think, because with a Hefeweizen, unfortunately, if you go too high in temperature, because of the other stresses, you're going to produce sulfur. And I don't like sulfur in Hefeweizen. Yeah,
so the common knowledge, I think, most people would think probably, is that you would want to do a Hefeweizen fairly warm, even, maybe closer, in the 70s Fahrenheit. Maybe the mid to even upper 70s Fahrenheit to try to get as much fruit as possible. But that's not what you're saying.
No, not necessarily. Firstly, the yeast strain itself, a Hefeweizen strain, naturally produces quite a bit of ester. You're underpitching, you're, limiting the oxygen, and 20 is already a fairly high temperature. As far as yeasts go, 20 or 68 is already pretty high. Now, it again, depends on the exact Hefeweizen strain you have, as to, maybe what you can get away with in your process and everything else. But personally, I would go for a slightly lower temperature, but again, it's experience. If under your conditions you find, 22 or 70s or whatever work for you, and they give you a good end product, well, then stick with it. A lot of it is just trial and error and experience.
And taking good notes.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, you're more than welcome.
So there you go. It's kind of counterintuitive. We say that you pitch lots of yeast, but apparently with like a Hefeweizen, you pitch enough yeast, but you don't overpitch, because the fact, what happens when the yeast grows and multiplies, that adds to that Hefeweizen, those banana flavors and all that. So, an interesting story. I'm going to tell on one of the homebrewers that wrote me a letter. He said he wrote me a letter saying, "You've got to help me, because there's this off flavor in my beer. I'd made a Hefeweizen, and there's this banana flavor that I just can't get rid of." What happened?
I've done everything I can. It won't go away.
What happened? A slice of lemon will get rid of that flavor, but it'll mask the flavor. But, what did I do wrong? I get this banana flavor in my Hefeweizen. So I said, you did a great job. You did a wonderful job. Celebrate the banana.
Celebrate the banana. I think Jimmy Durante said that first. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it was Mae West.
You don't hear that every day. Celebrate the banana. Maybe that's the next Basic Brewing T-shirt.
Yeah.
Oh, so anyway, that's. I just had to. I'm not naming names, but he did a wonderful job of home brewing and didn't realize it. Steve, thanks again for coming over and helping me put together the show.
Well, thanks, James. And I just want to point out that no animals were harmed in the testing of this show. So, just in case any of our listeners are members of PETA.
Is it people for
eating treatment of ale?
Oh, there you go. Hey,
there you go.
If we form a home brewing club, we'll use that.
Yeah.
This is the standard spiel.
Oh, here we go.
And I may just have you read this. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, just write to james@basicbrewing.com or
Steve@basicbrewing.com.
Steve's got his own email address.
Boy, I'm moving up in the world.
Yeah, that's right. Or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can get great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our Introduction to Extract Home Brewing DVD, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us.
Online.
And we'll pack it in a little box ourselves. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer.
I'm Steve Wilkes.
Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our good buddy in Austin, Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.
Happy brewing.